So thank you for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn. What time is it? Our presenter, New England Regional Fellowship Consortium Fellow, Alexandra M. Macdonald, will discuss her research on alternative methods of knowing time in the 18th century craft spaces. Alexandra is a historian of the Anglo-Atlantic world, specializing in material culture from the early modern period to the beginning of the 19th century. She received both her BA and MA in art history and visual studies from the University of Victoria and holds an MA in history from William and Mary. She's currently working on her dissertation, which explores the intersections of sensory studies, material culture, and temporality in the long 18th century. So we're really excited to hear what you're up to, Alexandra. She was here not too long ago researching at the CHS, so we're really looking forward to an update. So I'll let you get started.
Awesome, thank you so much. Let me just start by sharing my slideshow here. Okay, can everybody see the slideshow? Yep, okay, cool. All right, so thank you all for coming today. I'm super excited to share a bit about my dissertation project broadly and then talk about some of the really cool sources found while I was at the CHS this past December. So before we jump in, I did want to thank Sarah Dixon. Oops, sorry, hang on, my Zoom keeps trying to crash. Just close that. If my Zoom crashes, I will pop back in.
I think we lost her for a second. Nope. Maybe. Oh no, you're muted, Ellie.
Sorry, it might be. Sometimes the Wi-Fi is a bit wonky here, so hopefully that doesn't happen. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. Let me just share the screen. 1 second. Okay, cool. All right, so before we jump in, I did want to say a few thank yous. So I just thank Sierra Dixon, Elena Peters, Julia Amaro, and Jen for all their help, both during my time at the CH and then in preparation for today's talk. I would also really like to thank everyone who helps to organize and coordinate the New England Regional Consortium Fellowship. I would not have been able to spend time at the CHS without this fellowship, so their support is super important to my research. So in preparation for today's talk, I asked
Uh-oh.
Okay, well, let's try again. Sorry, I'm not totally sure why it keeps kicking us out, but we'll try. Okay, so in preparation for today's talk, I asked some of my friends what they think of when they think about time. So my friend who's an art historian said that she thinks about tall case clocks and sort of the labor that it took to wind them over and over again, and sort of the very sort of kind of satisfying kind of gong they make every hour on the hour. Another friend said that he thinks about pocket watches or perhaps wristwatches. In his case, he kind of covets a Rolex Submariner. And then yet another friend said that they think about their iPhone and sort of all the different timers and calendars and schedule functions that the phone can do, in addition to being able to tell them the time of the day, both where they are and other places around the world. So their responses, all of which center around some form of mechanized timekeeper, a clock, a watch, or an iPhone, are not out of the ordinary. Whenever I tell people that I work on ideas of time in the 18th century, almost certainly the questions that I get are something along the lines of, well, when did we add the second hand? Or when did we stop caring about bells and start caring about clocks? Or one of my favorites is, well, when did they invent the wristwatch, which was World War I, as a spoiler. And these are all super, super interesting questions. But when I think about time, I think about it a little bit differently. So let me sort of talk you through that. So there's a sort of theme that runs throughout 18th century recipe collections and craft manuals, scientific treatises, and then in notes that are kind of scribbled on scraps of paper tucked into diaries or commonplace books, which are all sort of key sources for my research. So there'll be things like wait to observe the gentle noise of the fermentation, or let it burn until it's both black and bitter. Or my favorite, regard not time, but this sign. So in craft spaces across the British Atlantic world, notes like these suggest that time was actually experienced not by the ticking of the second hand or the gong of a clock, but by reading things like the sort of visual, the auditory, the olfactory, the gustatory, so taste, or the tactile signs of material change using the craft person's sensory body. So for me, when I think about time and how it could be measured by, for example, the increasing sort of chaos, as one of the 18th century sources describes it, of bubbles when beer is brewing, or of the head that forms on the liquid as it brews, sort of shifting and morphing, creating any number of irregular shapes, which a lot of people in the 18th century likened to kind of rockwork gardens or mountains. So the image on the screen here is just an example of beer fermenting. You can kind of see it sort of working with the steam coming off of it. And then the image on the right of the screen, the modern image, the cutaway, is just to kind of give a sense of what that sort of process looks like and kind of the fermentary rock garden that kind of develops on the head of the wort as it boils away. I also see evidence of the passage of time in the process of dyeing, particularly dyeing indigo. So indigo dye vats produce this sort of undulating flower or bloom, along with a series of sort of hissing and effervescing bubbles, and an almost kind of kaleidoscopic range of color changes as the dye shifts and as it ferments. So these changes are what help dyers track the passage of time in their workshops. So again, just to talk about the images on the screen, the image on the left here is a print from the mid-18th century. It shows yarn being dyed and then being hung to dry in a French workshop. Again, we can kind of see the working taking place with the steam. And then the image on the right, the kind of cutaway image, is a modern image of an indigo bloom. And as you can see, it shows some of these color changes that take place in the indigo dye vat as it ferments, as well as what the bloom itself looks like, which I think kind of looks like sugar spun honeycomb candy, you know, like inside a Crunchy bar. So as I hope these kind of two very brief examples have illustrated, in my research, I think about time a little bit differently. So for me, it's things like scum and froth and bubbles and wobbles and an almost kind of kaleidoscopic range of color changes that I use to think about time. These were the sort of signs that marked the passage of time in my makers' lives, and therefore it's these materials that I look to think about time. So in the time that we have together today, I would like to do a couple of things. So I thought that since this was part of my dissertation research fellowship, I'd start by talking about my project as a whole to kind of situate my research at the CHS. I then want to talk briefly about recipe collections, modern recipe collections, and early modern recipe collections, because they are one of the sort of the key sources for my work. And then I thought that after introducing recipe collections broadly, I would talk specifically about one book held at the CHS, which is the Jordan Williams recipe book. This one is fabulous. It's primarily a dye recipe book, but there are a few other things going on, so I thought we could kind of work through that a little bit as well today. Finally, I thought that I would end by talking explicitly about time and dyeing, and about the indigo dye process specifically, and kind of the really interesting sort of non-mechanical ways that I see time appearing in the process, in the records. So my project as a whole. My dissertation looks at 4 case studies to get a sense of how time was experienced in craft or artisanal spaces in the long 18th century, which for me means about 1660 to about 1830. Geographically, I'm looking at the mid-Atlantic and northeast regions of North America, Britain, which I guess as the running joke in British studies goes, really means England, and then every so often touching with Scotland and maybe a little bit in Ireland, depending on how things play out. And then to a lesser extent, at this point in the project, I'm thinking a little bit about the Caribbean or knowledge that's coming from the Caribbean to the other 2 spaces that I'm primarily focused on. The people that I'm interested in learning about are elite and middle-class white men who experimented with things like brewing, and pigments, and then published treatises and manuals like the one on the screen here. I'm also really interested in studying lower class white men who worked in craft spaces and who may not have written their ideas down or who wrote them down in different ways. They're captured in account books or in ledgers or waste books rather than in these sort of printed treatises, and who also show up in extant objects themselves. I'm also interested in looking at housewives and their daughters who conducted their own form of experiments with recipes and dyes and scribbled their notations in diaries or family recipe collections. Finally, I studied both indentured and enslaved women and men whose labor and knowledge must be pieced together from newspaper advertisements or reading sort of against the biased grain in manuscript sources and from extant material culture. And I know that this sounds like I'm studying everyone and it's sort of a lot to take in, and it certainly is. But what I found as this project has developed is that in their sort of daily lived experience, in these maker spaces that I'm so interested in, boundaries between these different groups is perhaps a little bit more permeable. And so to really understand how they're experiencing time, how they're functioning in these spaces, it's helpful to at least try to see them working and living in sort of alongside one another. So as I said, my dissertation has 4 case studies, each of which is centered around a different process and a different set of materials, although there is some kind of cool overlap with fermentation. So in my brewing case study, I'm really interested in exploring makers' bodies and how makers' bodies understand time. So much of brewing is sensory. And in fact, brewing, I think, really requires all 5 senses, so touch, smell, sight, sound, and taste. So in this case study, I'm thinking about how brewers trained their body to sort of become a form of sensory technology. They really needed to sort of be able to interpret and understand even minute changes in materials to ensure the process was moving along properly. Another one of my case studies, I'm looking at sort of kitchens and dairies. And here I'm thinking about processes like cheese making, pickling, and preserving. And in this chapter, I'm super interested in thinking about how these different processes were shaped by the materials, the climate, and personal experience of the person doing the making, again, rather than any kind of external watch or clock. My third case study, Dyes and Textiles, which we're going to focus on the most today, explores a space where time was kind of necessarily, I would say, cumulative, a little bit invisible, nonlinear, and kind of episodic, as well as being both sensory and very much tied to materials. So dye recipes, like the ones we're going to talk about in a few minutes, required a deep knowledge of materials and how these materials changed. And then the process of dyeing itself required a number of sort of repetitive engagements with the dye vat and with the fabric. So for example, dipping a textile or dipping wool a number of times and having it dry in between and those kinds of things. My final case study is looking at paints and pigments. And this one, I'm really interested in chemistry with a Y. So pre-modern chemistry, chemistry with a Y is a little bit sort of more capacious. And thinking about how this kind of chemistry helps us understand timekeeping with fixatives, additives, and then the durability of paints and pigments. Ultimately, I want to answer sort of 4 big questions. So how was time experienced in maker spaces? What role did senses and sensory knowledge play in perceptions of time? If we're thinking about it from a material culture point of view, typically we look at an object's date and we kind of think moving forward about an object's afterlife. I'm interested in an object's pre-life. How did it all come together in these spaces? What did it mean as it's sort of being formed? And what does that tell us about time? And then finally, I want to think about, is handwork an embodied practice a form of knowledge? And if so, what does that mean? So hopefully this has given you sort of a broad sense of my project. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end about any of these case studies. I looked at some sources for all of them at the Historical Society, but I'd like to focus on one sort of case study today with dyeing, so we can also talk about that at the end. So I thought now we'll turn to sort of a brief discussion of recipe books as a source for thinking about the 18th century. So I often find it helpful for just my own thinking to find sort of a modern example or a cognate to situate us what's sort of the same and what's different about the 18th century. So I grew up in Canada, I'm from Vancouver, and I think that every Canadian kitchen, at least or Canadian kitchen where I'm from, had this cookbook. This is the Five Roses cookbook. And when I was a kid, this was sort of the capital R recipe book that I immediately think of. Modern recipe books like this, we can kind of expect to find a few things, right? So often we'll find a list of exactly what ingredients we need and how much of each ingredient to use. Oftentimes the ingredients are grouped together by ingredient type, so liquids together, dry goods together, those types of things. Oftentimes we'll also expect to see sort of step-by-step instructions that make somewhat logical sense. Mix all the dry ingredients together, mix all the liquid together, and then mix these two mixtures together. There's also often a temperature for an oven or a stovetop, and cooking time can be measured more precisely in hours or minutes, depending on what you're making. The recipes themselves, as a collection in this printed book, are grouped together. So soups together, bread together, cookies together, for example. Finally, I think when we think about modern recipe books, typically, if not exclusively, we're probably thinking about cookbooks. All of the recipes in the Five Roses cookbook are recipes for food. There are no recipes for things like varnishes or dyeing your wool blue or curing the bite of a rabid dog, for example. For those things, we'd have to find a different manual, a different craft book, or potentially a pharmacist. So these are just not going to be in the Five Roses cookbook. So if modern recipe books have this particular sort of format, what about early modern recipe books? So in the 17th and 18th century, I think that the books that I'm looking at least, the best sort of way to think about them is kind of to define them as a loosely connected collection of information. The recipes, or the receipts as they're often titled in the period, could include recipes for the preparation of food, but the same book could also very easily, and for my sources almost always did, also include things like drinks, so cider, beer, sometimes whiskey, depending on where I'm looking at, medications, cosmetics, veterinary treatments, both for sort of smaller animals, and then depending on where you're looking at these books, for sort of livestock, dyes, paints, any number of household substances. A lot of things are like, how do you stop mites from eating things? How do you cure your house of rats? Those kinds of things. And then occupationally specific materials. So things like varnishes and lacquers for a cabinet maker, for example. These recipe books were most often not written by a single person, even if there was a claim by the author that they were the author. And they didn't actually often list all the necessary ingredients or how much of each ingredient to use. There's sort of an assumption on behalf of the author that the person coming to the book already knows certain things. Sometimes recipes were clumped together, but they didn't have to be. So soup could be together, or it could be every 17th page. And then rather than include step-by-step instructions, many of the recipes really did leave a lot unsaid. There's a lot of assumption of tacit knowledge in these books, which makes them both fascinating to research and sometimes infuriating to research. Importantly for my work, recipe or receipt was a much more capacious term. So I would like to think about recipes in the talk today as dye recipes, so dyeing for textiles. So during my time at the CHS, I spent actually quite a few days working with this fabulous vellum-covered recipe collection. So this collection is currently attributed to William Jordan. It spans the years 1760 to 1828, so a period of almost 70 years. It appears to have been used in, or at least had recipes added from, a few different locations, including London and Philadelphia. As I said, it is predominantly a dye recipe book, so it includes things like recipes for dyeing with indigo, or a wide variety of reds, for example. But, like others of its period, It's not a singularly focused book. It also includes, recipes for cooking. In this case, I think it's 3 recipes for puddings, one of which is a rice pudding, which a scholar of food history has recreated the different kind of options of rice pudding, and one I will say looks more appetizing than the other, but they're sort of, it kind of gets at sort of how these things can change from recipe to recipe. It also includes a lot of medicinal recipes. So things like how to bring down swelling, how to soothe a toothache, how to cure jaundice, how to make a salve, which for someone working with dyes and hot liquids would probably have been quite useful. As a sort of interesting aside that I just keep thinking about, most of the dye books that I've been working with have at least one recipe for some form of alcohol, usually cider or beer. This book doesn't have any, which could mean nothing, or it could be something interesting. I just think it's fascinating that this book is a ton of medical recipes and just none of these alcoholic beverages that typically you find elsewhere. So I promise we will get to talking about time, but part of what makes this source really fascinating is all of the different information that we can learn from it, which does include time, but which also is really about evidence of, I think, experimentation and these communities of dyers and the sort of sharing of knowledge across these communities. So if you'll bear with me, I would like to talk a little bit about this book as a source and what we can learn from it as a source, because I think it's a really compelling and sort of, in some ways, unique example of a genre. And then we'll talk about time specifically in the context of indigo dyeing. So if you remember from a few minutes ago, I mentioned that early and modern recipe books are almost never single authored, even when they claim to be. I think the point of this point is driven home with this book beautifully. Because as you work through it, there are at least 5 different hands or different scripts that appear in the book. So as I hope we can see on the screen, each of these scripts is slightly different, which I'm reading as suggesting that perhaps at least 5 different people contributed to this book by adding recipes, adding notes, those types of things. What makes it even more interesting is that these different scripts are interspersed throughout the book. So it's not one script, then the next script, then the next script. Although the script on the upper left with greens to print and greens to print, that one does appear most frequently in the book, and broadly it's sort of more grouped at the beginning of the book, but it does kind of appear throughout. So first thing we know about this book then, more than one author, at least 5 people contributing to it. What also makes this book really fascinating is it's a document of what Sarah Pennell has called choreographies of connection. So in essence, this book captures networks of exchange and experimentation among at least 3 different groups of dyers. So London, Philadelphia, and potentially Ireland. A couple of the recipes note Ireland. It could just be the recipe itself comes from Ireland, but I'd like to look into that a little bit more as I keep working with this source. So what you're seeing on the screen here is a sort of cacophony, a visual cacophony of all these names that appear in the recipe collection. And I think seeing just how many names appear really does illustrate quite clearly that creating recipe knowledge, in this case, dye recipe knowledge, was a collective, collaborative, and really often cumulative type of work. So in this book, most cases of collaboration come from sort of the recipes all being brought together into this one source. But there is one example in which 2 men are working together in the same shop, presumably. We can also see the gendered nature of this book in the names on the screen. So there are 57 names that appear in this recipe collection, 56 of which are men, and 1 is a woman. Of the names that appear in the book, William Jordan appears dozens of times throughout the 200 pages, which might help to explain why it's attributed to him. Others, like William Bigland, appear a handful of times, and then others still, like William, appear only once. So I'm still trying to sort through how all of these people were connected, but there are a few sort of possibilities that I think would be interesting to talk through quickly with you now. So first off, family. In some cases, family members collaborated on creating recipe collections. So husband and wives, fathers and sons, mothers, daughters. all collaborated on recipe books. This might be one way to think about all the different handwriting that appears in this book and the vast number of names. So given that the book spans an almost 70-year period, it might not be a stretch to think about this being compiled by successive generations of a family. Another reason for creating recipe collections was sort of sociability and knowledge creation. I think at the very least, we can safely say this book is absolutely about sharing knowledge and creating knowledge. By bringing all these recipes into the same collection, the compilers were both developing and sharing their knowledge of dye recipes and the dye process. As I keep working to piece together as many names as I can and figure out who they might have actually been, it might be possible to kind of bring in more of the sociability aspect of it, but for now I think thinking about it as a knowledge exchange is quite helpful. Which brings us to kind of the last reason this might have been put together. Oftentimes, cookery recipe books were part of a gift exchange. And I think what might be going on here is perhaps less of a gift exchange and more of, again, the sort of knowledge exchange. So part of an informal network of kind of scientific or material experimentation within these dyeing communities. These kind of choreographies of connection become sort of more complicated with these three notations that you can see on the screen. So our man dollar, Mr. Johnson's man, and Old Moore. In other sources I've been working with, notations like this that refer to sort of an our man or Mr. X's man or Old X have been references to enslaved African American, or in some cases, indigenous people of descent. I have not been able to yet find find records on any of these men specifically, nor have I been able to find recipes on their, records on their enslavers to work out exactly who they might have been. But what's really interesting to me about these is that they're actually named, admittedly in one case via their enslaver. The first two names are attached to recipes. And by naming the two recipes for these men, it's explicitly acknowledging not just their labor, as is perhaps sometimes more present in an archive, but their knowledge of recipes and procedures, which is, I think, for my work, I've been finding it harder to find explicit references to their knowledge. The third name on the slide, Old Moore, is attached to a recipe for red that we're going to see in a few slides. He's not listed as sort of the owner of the recipe, but his knowledge of what is going on in the dye house is recognized in the statement of, quote, Old Moore says Kirby boiled the Brazil, so Brazil wood, in vinegar. At the very least, this statement suggests that Moore was working alongside Kirby as they both created the red dye. It might also suggest that Moore was actually the person with the knowledge, but the sort of racial politics of putting these books together in the 18th century meant that the knowledge was stripped away from him and ascribed to his enslaver. In either case, it's another record that explicitly talks about knowledge rather than just labor. So one of the big roadblocks that I'm running into as I work through my project is that I know that enslaved women and men of African and indigenous descent were working in the spaces that I study. And I know that in many of the spaces, it was actually their knowledge, recipes, and labor that was keeping track of the marking of the passage of time. But I rarely find even sort of the smallest notation that explicitly acknowledges their centrality. Oftentimes they appear in things like this, uncertain who. But in this case, to figure out who that might be requires a lot of contextual work. So it's really interesting and exciting to see these three men as being labeled as having the knowledge of these recipes. Another big feature of the receipt book that makes it sort of really exciting to work with is all the notations of experimenting and trials. So scholar Pamela Smith has argued that recipes are written records of trial and experimentation. And it could be individually, or as we see on the screen right now, it could mean as a collection. So what you're seeing here is 5 different recipes, all of which will produce a red dye. However, each recipe, there's something that's been changed in either a minor or a more major way. So for example, the second recipe for Kirby notes that it's the same as Walker's red above, but that you should be using strong beer and more alum. And then again, Old Moore, who we just met, is noting that the Brazil wood was steeped in vinegar. This book also shows us trial and error experimentation in the form of observations. So in this case, the experimentation is taking place off the page, i.e. the compilers of the book have not recorded the process of experimentation, but instead they've kind of captured other people's observations, and then they're bringing the observations into this book. And most of the observations, at least in this example, are to swap out one ingredient for another or to add more or less ingredients. So the first two examples were sort of other dyers experimenting with recipes, but we do also see the compilers of this book experimenting themselves. So the category of experience was yet another metric that could be used to kind of judge the efficacy of a recipe and make clear that it had been tweaked or perfected by the person recording the recipe. So in the image on the left of the screen, the compiler has included the word experienced in the title of their dye. And in the image on the right of the screen, they've made a notation after the recipe that it's both good and they've had experience working with it. Other evidence of experimentation that we can see are things like emphasis, so underlining, do not scald or heat the tallow. Adding things, so making sure that it should be a single red and not just a generic red. Third example, crossing things out, adding something else, crossing out calico, adding a different fabric. And in the final example, just deleting words or deleting things that didn't work. Finally, when recipes were good, they made note of it. When they were bad, they also made note of it. Although, interestingly, I could have sworn there were more recipes in this book that had notations saying they were bad, but when I came back to put it all together for the presentation, there was only one. So either this is like some amazing thing, or they're just not recording it, or they're recording it in a different way that I haven't figured out yet. And then finally, they also recorded when things were quite safe. So it could be, this is an example of a medicine, so presumably quite safe means quite safe to ingest, but also quite safe could show up on dye recipes, which may mean they were safe sort of, again, in a kind of health way, or they were safe insofar as they would hold fast. The dye would stay in the fabric, so commercially they would kind of be a safe bet. So as a source, this recipe book is really amazingly rich. It's a record of community, both of the 5 people who contributed to it by writing in it and of the 57 people whose names appear throughout the book. It contains a ton of active experimentation, both by the people compiling it and by the recipes they're bringing into the book. It also provides insight into how time was experienced by dyers, and one of my favorite dye stuff to talk about is indigo. So I thought we would talk about that now to kind of wrap us up. So indigo is a natural dye that was extracted from the leaves and stems of Indigo Indigofera tinctura, Indigofera anil, and woad plants. It can be used to dye cotton, wool, or silk. So if you're wearing blue jeans right now, it's possible that was dyed with indigo. What I think makes indigo so interesting for my work, at least the material part of my work, is that all of the ways in which it's talked about in dye recipe books, like the William Jordan book, are sensory. So in my sources, again, time is not measured by the clock or the watch, but it's measured by material change in the indigo as it works. So let's look at a couple of examples. So to talk about indigo, I'm going to draw on information both from the William Jordan recipe book, as well as from the Country Dyer's Assistant, which is a printed manual that's also in the CHS collection, and kind of piece them together. So both the recipes in the Jordan recipe book and the Country Dyer's Assistant pay close attention to the temporality of the indigo dye process, especially in the process of the creation of the dye bath itself. So both compilers noted that the dyer would know their indigo vat was ready when bubbles appear, and by repeating the plunges 6 or 7 times. So plunges is raking the indigo vat to kind of stir it up and ensure that it's fermenting. So when the bubbles appear, if a thick blue froth arises on the surface of the dye and continues to float, and if it put on the appearance of a darkish green, then the dyer could be satisfied with the vat. The dye could then be pronounced in a good state and fit for coloring. Supplementing their sort of visual sense of time in the indigo process, both noted in their instructions that on caring for an indigo dye vat, when it was hot weather, that the vat needed to only be reheated once every 3 or 4 weeks. And the dyer could tell when that right time to reheat it was, so the proper number of days had elapsed, because maggots, quote, will now appear on the surface and must be taken off, and when it becomes glutinous, it must then be boiled and scummed, and then you can kind of get it back into proper order. What is so cool, if perhaps a little gross here, is that it's not time, right? It's not mechanized time. Instead, time is measured in all the different changes in the material itself, or in this case, in the organisms that grow on top of the vat. And these are the changes the dyer could use to understand time, and they could understand them using their sensory body. As another example to kind of flesh this out a bit, Thomas Cooper wrote another book about sort of process of dyeing that was sort of circulating around the British Atlantic. And he's talking about how to properly set a vat. And so he's noting how, quote, it's very useful to employ either putrid water or an old vat of matter to accelerate the fermentation. If neither of these were on hand, the dyer could grind 12 to 15 pounds of woad, put it in a basket of hot water, and leave it to warm to ferment. Once warm, they could add yeast, and in a short time the fermentation begins, the woad becomes a fine green color, and it serves as a kind of ferment or leaven for the vat. The vat should then be stirred and covered, but he instructed the dyer that they, quote, must put their ear to it from time to observe the gentle noise of the fermentation within, which should not be permitted to go on too hastily. So you would listen and then you would stir. And you needed to be careful that the fermentation was confined to the bottom, because if the liquor became ill-colored, quote, the working of the vat throws particles to the top, and it's a sign that it works too strongly. He was talking about how if the fermentation is going too quickly, too fast, it could be as damaging to the dye as if it was working too slowly. As the process developed, Cooper stated that the eye and the ear must not alone be trusted to be the workman. For the purposes of ascertaining whether the vat is in order, the sense of smelling too will greatly assist. So including the sort of olfactory knowledge, he noted that the odor is much the same as pencil blue and may be recognized by dissolving an ounce of indigo by means of liver of sulfur. And the smell should not be quite so strong, but similar. So here the scent knowledge is guiding the process, but also sort of assuming a broader sensory knowledge of dyeing with blue. Smell is comparative and relies on this kind of tacit knowledge of other scents and other passages of time. He noted that, quote, the woad man will be guided by this odor as to when the vat is fit to work. And by it, he should then be guided to put in his lime. Overall, he noted that as you stir it, you should see fine blue veins shoot through the yellow liquor, and then you should be working it boldly. With some practice, the directions given here are enough to make any man a good workman. So as these examples indicate, or as I'm hoping they indicate, each of these authors is instructing their reader to kind of use this tacit, sensory, material knowledge of temporality rather than mechanical time to dictate how and when to interact with the dye vat. And interestingly, even when we do see mechanized time coming into the descriptions, often these mechanized time examples are kind of backstopped by descriptions of sensory timekeeping. So something will come up like, boil for 3 hours. But then there'll be a sort of description of a visual or an auditory or an olfactory backup to tell if it's actually working. So boil for 3 hours unless it's not doing X, Y, or Z, or boil for 3 hours unless it doesn't smell as good. So kind of this sort of thinking about how those two things fit together. So I think in order to give us time for questions, maybe I'll wrap up with two of the questions that I have that kind of I keep thinking over with this project that maybe some of you might have some thoughts on, or some tips on where to find at least one of the sources I've been looking for and can't seem to find. So as I said, I'm still working on my dissertation. It's not yet fully written. So one of the big considerations that I have with a project like this is for thinking about the realities of craft spaces and understandings of time in these spaces that kind of captures the complexity of experience. So maker spaces were neither solely or even necessarily predominantly white spaces. However, the Jordan Williams recipe collection is somewhat unique in making these three explicit mentions of the knowledge of these enslaved men. So I'm trying to work through how and when to read knowledge back into the different mentions we see of enslaved people working in these spaces. Oftentimes, people are not appearing in records until they have been commodified as part of an advertisement for sale or for moving through other craft spaces. And so thinking about their knowledge as being central to this process and their knowledge of time, their knowledge of materials as dictating how these craft spaces work, how time functions in these spaces is something I'm kind of still working through as I think through this. The other sort of question is one that I wasn't expecting to sort of be a problem as I work through. So a lot of the processes I work with require yeast. And so I assumed that yeast recipes and just discussions of yeast and collections of wild yeast would be everywhere in the 17th and 18th century archive. And they are in the 19th century, and they're a little bit in the 18th century, but I think I still have the big question, like, where's the yeast? Why is no one talking about yeast in the way that I thought they would be? So that's really more of a self-serving question that if anyone has good ideas on 18th century yeast production, please shoot me an email. Other than that, as I said, to give us some time for questions, maybe I'll wrap up there. And thank you all so much for listening to my thoughts on my dissertation.
Awesome. Thank you, Ellie. That was really great. Your images were amazing, really zooming in on that. I think that was great for all of us. If anybody has any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. Certainly can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question that way. That would be great. Ellie, have you been able to pinpoint where William Jordan was from?
Not yet, in part because the recipe book includes mentions of Philadelphia, London, as I said, a couple places in Ireland. So I'm trying to work out exactly where he's from. One of the things I'm hoping to be able to do is maybe backtrack on some of the recipes and contextually place him somewhere, but I haven't yet been able to do that with any kind of certainty.
But did he live in Connecticut, do we know?
I'm not totally sure.
Not even sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
That sounds like a whole nother dissertation to figure out where everyone mentioned in the book is location, how they're connected.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anybody, any questions?
Yeah, I have a question, actually. Hi, Allie.
Hi.
I was wondering if this is kind of what I always ask someone when they're, elbow deep into research. Is there anything since you've started working on this project that has really stuck with you or surprised you, or just you think you'll just have blown your mind, kind of? That's always my question for dissertation folks. Like, what has absolutely blown your mind in your research so far?
So I started this project thinking I was going to work on like clocks and watches, and they would be like, I'd be thinking about like, changes in technology. And as I went to, my first archive visit, and I was reading through all these manuals, thinking like, I was kind of expecting there to be like, boil for X number of minutes or like do these things. And so many people, I started with the brewing books, and everyone was talking about how time was unreliable, like mechanized time was unreliable. And so I don't know if it like blew my mind. Well, I guess it did kind of blow my mind because I was sitting in the archive being like, well, hang on, where are the clocks? But I think it totally changed how I think about time for the people that I'm looking at. Because in the brewing part of my dissertation, people are explicitly saying, ignore the time, ignore, what are those things called? Hourglasses, ignore watches, ignore clocks. They're useless. What you have to be thinking about is all these different ways in which you can train your body to engage with heat and climate and the temperature of like touch things, smell things, listen to things. And so I think that kind of changed my entire argument broadly, because I think I'm now thinking about time as this very embodied, very sensory thing. And yes, there's all these mechanized changes that are happening in the 18th century, but I think I'm going to argue that for my people, like it's happening, it's sort of percolating in the back, but for them, this is the type of technology, this is the type of time that still really matters. So I guess that is kind of a shift in what I was expecting to find in the archive and then what I did actually end up finding in the archive.
Anyone else? Questions? Please feel free to unmute yourself or throw it in the chat. Angelina, did you have a question?
Actually, I just had a couple comments to your questions. One, on the yeast issue, have you looked at the making of apples, of cider, of hard cider at the time period? Because in the 1830s up at Ulster Village, they actually do the whole process, and they don't add pre-made yeast. They get it naturally, so it's not something that's made, and that might be a source for you. The other thing is this the recipe book that you're looking at? It sounds like this is for a factory production as opposed to house production. So can you find out through census records the owners of the different dye factories and whether or not they actually own slaves to help you with the enslaved people? Because if they didn't own enslaved people, then they wouldn't have had them working. But if they own them, it would show up in the census records as those very sad ticks.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think I'm trying to figure out how to fit in my project is that in some ways as to the sort of factory versus home home production. In some ways, I'm looking at like a difference of scale. So as I get later into my project, it's sort of the transition to larger scale production. Earlier in my project, it's sort of smaller scale production. But what's interesting for me is that I kind of want to see them more on a continuum than maybe we've seen them in the past. So I think as far as how to find out about enslaved people, I need to figure out a way if I can, I need to look through more wills perhaps, or more probate inventories earlier. And then I think you're right, later on looking at census records would be quite helpful to kind of, I think the record type might change as I move through time.
And then I just had one other question. As you're looking at this sensory time, especially with the gathering of natural materials for dye, do you see the sensory for this changing over time as we move more away from the natural materials for the dyes into the synthetic materials?
So one of the big questions that I'm sort of trying to work out is sort of how sensory bodies move throughout the time of my project. Because I think early on, and certainly in the sort of core of the 18th century, a sensory body is required to make these processes flow properly. And I think maybe what I'm trying to think through is part of industrialization, standardization, capitalism, removing that centrality of a sensory body and having any body become the body that can function. And I think that's kind of what I'm trying to work through, because I think through professionalization and any number of other things that are happening sort of late 18th, early 19th century, I think you do move from kind of a sort of self-knowledge of a body as sensory and being trainable and all these different kind of sensory engagements with materials and time. And the stripping away of that is perhaps what helps enable industrialization. Because if you don't have to have, if you have one person rather than a whole slew of people, that might be kind of part of that. So I'm sort of still kind of work through what the body means as we move from the sort of late 17th and into the early 19th century.
I'm curious if that becomes a factor of the scale of production, more that you see it moving more towards time as we see it, as it's just you're such a large scale as we get closer to the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to figure out if it's chicken and egg, like what's the chicken and what's the egg, right? Like how,
exactly.
Like how do bodies fit into this as bodies,
Right.
and sort of all the sensory richness of bodies, and then sort of the mechanics of bodies. And I'm still trying to figure out how those pieces all fit together. And stay tuned, I guess.
So we do have, Catherine is mentioning that yeast is naturally found in apple skins as well
cool.
as the air, although how would they capture airborne yeast? I'm not sure. She does not know as well. So, but certainly apple skin. Thank you, Catherine. This is really fascinating. There's so many different piece parts to this project. This is huge.
Yeah.
Really
Yeah.
neat.
Yeah, it's been a fun project to work on. It's one of those things where it's both fun and kind of infuriating when it's huge, because it allows you to kind of see hopefully big trends, but then it's so big that you think, like, how do I put it all back together at the end, I guess.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm curious, if William Jordan is let's say a local person from one particular town, sort of dying on a relatively small scale, are they communicating with people that are very far away? How big is their circle, I guess, for having this collective knowledge? That would be interesting to see as well.
Yeah, that's why I'm super interested by these notations for Ireland, because whether it's just, so sometimes other books I've looked at, it's like has said Irish, and in those contexts, it's been that the person had read a book published in Ireland and then put it into their book with a notation Ireland or Irish Ireland, which could be what's happening here. But it would be nice to sort of look into, because his book has more sort of first person notation, it has more editing, it has more collaboration. Although I think maybe I should stop saying his book. The book compiled by these 5 people, one of whom happens to probably be William. It would be interesting to sort of see, like, is there some sort of network of letters going back and forth? Is it,
right,
or is it both? Is it sort of small scale community and then letters? Or is it 3 small communities, one in London, one in Philadelphia, one somewhere else, that are all kind of coming into these books? So I think you're right. I think it's like an entire chapter to be written about just the people and how they move and how the knowledge is shared and what that all means. In this chapter.
Right.
In this book, I mean.
Absolutely. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any other questions for Allie? All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This was really great. I would like to just share for a moment some upcoming events that we have at the CHS. Here we go. So we do have a little behind the scenes tour scheduled for Saturday, February 11th. So that's coming up. There's either an 11 o'clock or 2 o'clock, and we'll take you behind the scenes to a couple of our collection spaces and look at some Connecticut stories, people, ordinary and extraordinary members of the Black community that were right here in Connecticut. And then we have our next Lunch and Learn on Tuesday, February 21st. This is also a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium Fellow, Frances O'Shaughnessy, and she will talk about the Black Revolution on the Sea Island. So she's going to, including using one letter from our collection, historicize the Gullah Geechee people's expressions of freedom during the Civil War. So that will be very interesting. And then I also wanted to tell you a little bit about, we have an on-site program March 2nd. We have a speaker, historian Allison Lang, will talk about the 1890s and how, with women embracing the bicycle and the freedom of movement that came with that. So she'll talk a little bit about women's rights, so another great program. So you can check out more information on these and at our website and other upcoming events as well. So at chs.org. And I will stop share. And I see this, just want to make sure there's no more questions. Okay. There's Catherine just saying thank you. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. And I will certainly send out the YouTube link that should be available in the next week or so. So I'll send that to everyone. And Allie, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming and listening to my thoughts.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
See you soon.